would like to ask you to consider the vital communication that is required for bridging innovation drives with regulatory perspectives, which we will hear more about in our first panel for the morning, the Data and Regulation panel. With this, I would like to welcome all of our esteemed panel members this morning. We have our chair, Dr. Glen Gowers, who is co-founder and CEO at Basecamp Research. And our esteemed panel members include Mr. Boris Azaïs, who is Director of Policy Europe and Canada and MSD, Dr. Rachel Herder, who is from Mammoth Biosciences, who flew in all the way from the US. Thank you, Rachel. And she's VP of Intellectual Property and Associate General Counsel. We also have Erik from CropScience, who is VP and Head of Regulatory Science in EMEA region. And Julie Pierce from the Food Standards Agency, Director of Wells Information and Science. And last but not least, Rebecca Sudlow from Roche, who is Data Privacy Sharing Pod Lead. I hope you all enjoyed the session very much. Welcome, guys, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to the GAP Summit Committee for putting this together. I think we're all really looking forward to this, the Data and Regulation panel session. So I'll just start with a little bit of introduction to myself, and then pass to our absolutely wonderful panelists to introduce themselves and what we'll be doing today. So I'm Glen, founder of Basecamp Research, and we are a company that deals a lot with biodiversity data. So something that will sort of appear in this panel discussion is that we all deal with different types of data, from ag to food to pharmaceuticals to therapeutics and all over the place. So I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion. I started my career in biochemistry, did an undergraduate there and a PhD then in synthetic biology, before starting Basecamp off the back of an expedition to Europe's largest ice cap, where we became the first team to do fully off-grid DNA sequencing. And that really started my journey, at least, into gathering data and understanding data at a global level, mostly surrounded by biodiversity data. But I want to pass over to our panelists, and I'd love you guys to introduce yourselves, what you do, and particularly to tell the audience what sort of data it is that you're dealing with on a more day-to-day basis, and kind of the industries that you're in, and give people a flavour of that. So maybe I'll just start with you, Erik, next to me.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for the invitation. It's been a long time. I was in Cambridge. It was lovely to be back. My name is Erik. I work for Bayer CropScience. So Bayer is, of course, a pharmaceutical company, but also very active in the agricultural sector. So I work in that agricultural division. I'm a bioengineer in chemistry by base formation from Belgium originally. I started almost 25 years ago in the sector, and I've always been in regulatory science. So the type of data that we deal with is registration data for products in the area of crop protection, in the area of seed and traits. So for now, that's often biotechnology-derived traits, in the future, hopefully, new genomic techniques, etc. as well. And increasingly, there's innovation in the digital arena as well, so digital agronomy. All those things are coming together, and our vision as a company is to drive sustainable food production, and I think that will resonate really well with some of the things I've already heard being themes here at the conference. So that's me in a nutshell.
I'm sure, as we'll dig in later, you've worked around the world in many different places.
Yes, I'm from Belgium, and I worked in the EMEA region at first, and then spent 13.5 years of my time in the US. And then I had the opportunity to go work in Singapore. I led our Asia-Pacific region, and I'm really just back after 16 years on the road in Europe since November.
That's
so
great.
I'm still learning and relearning a lot about the region here.
Great. Julie?
Thank you. Yes, Julie Pierce from the Food Standards Agency here in the UK. I started my career as an oceanographer, mathematician, so there I am looking at the whole of the planet, really, certainly the wet parts of it. And pretty early on I realised it was all about data, and so I think that was sort of cast me in my career going forward, real great interest in data and what it could do. I moved away from oceanography into sort of more mainstream IT projects, working across the world, trying to come up with data-enabled solutions for all sorts of different problems, whether financial services or pharma or government. And more recently, over the last couple of years, I've moved into working for UK government in food, either in agriculture or now in food safety and authenticity. And deeply thrilled to see myself surrounded by food and data within the whole of the food system. So the data I'm interested in may be from our scientific research that we undertake, or it could be industry data. And we can talk a little bit about that later as to how much data there is when I look out across the whole of the global food system, and that's my opportunity there.
That's great, thank you, Julie.
Hi, I'm Rachel Herder. I'm from the United States. I got my PhD and my law degree from the University of Minnesota. My PhD is in molecular biology, and I was in a developmental biology lab kind of when Illumina sequencing started to just become affordable for PhD students to utilize. So at the very tail end of my PhD, I got to experience a rush of big data, and I really liked it. So after graduating, I worked for a law firm called Wilson Sonsini that specializes in representing biotech startups. And that's where I started my career. I moved on to the East Coast into Boston, and I was a professor at Penn State Law for a few years teaching law students. But I really like representing startups. So when a company called Mammoth Biosciences was looking for their first in-house attorney, I jumped at the opportunity. And so there, our company discovers new CRISPR enzymes, and we utilize them for both diagnostics and therapeutics. So we're a R&D stage company in both diagnostics and therapeutics, and we also spend a lot of efforts discovering. So the type of data I'm interested in is bacterial genome data, and then also all the data that our scientists generate, and of course, access to patient samples for development of these things.
So hi, I'm Rebecca Sudlow. I work for Roche Pharmaceuticals, actually at their UK base, just down the road in Welwyn Garden City. I'm a statistician by training, and once I finished my master's degree, I started working for what was ICI Pharmaceuticals then, now AstraZeneca. But since then, I've been at Roche for many, many years. So I've probably been working in clinical trial drug development for about 30 years now. So yeah, my experience has been very much around patient-level data, so clinical trial participants, initially helping design trials, analyse them, whole drug development programs, working with the regulators on approvals and things like that. But sort of 7 or 8 years ago, I took a sideways move as the data sharing kind of movement took place within pharmaceutical development. So we needed sort of people to help and support and lead reuse of patient-level data. So I head a global group now where we enable the access to patient-level data from Roche clinical trials to qualified researchers. So it's sort of built on my experience as a statistician, but then kind of using things in a bit of a sideways way. So thank you for inviting me.
Good morning. My name is Boris Azaïs. I work for MSD, which is known as Merck & Co. in the US. Not to be confused with the German Merck. So it's two different pharmaceutical companies, but it used to be the same 100 years ago. So MSD is a very large pharmaceutical company with a long legacy of first-in-class products across the 20th century, and with a very broad portfolio of therapeutics across chronic disease, infectious disease, women's health, vaccines, and cancer, obviously. And my work, I'm more of a generalist on this panel. I was trained as a lawyer. I practiced commercial law for a number of years. And then when I moved to MSD, I started working into policy. So my main priority is the legal, the regulatory, the regulation framework that enables us to turn science into products. And so from the title, it's not so much data that I'm interested, but more in the regulation part. Because when you think about it, when it comes to developing pharmaceuticals or vaccines, it's pretty much a human invention in terms of policy. The framework that enables us to develop search science, then turn that into products that can help patients, that's not a given. In fact, you need government policies all across the life cycle. It's quite striking. It has nothing to do with the normal market, and in and out of itself, it's really very innovative, because you need to invest in science, in tertiary education, then you need to invest in healthcare, so that there is this mutualization of the risk, the financing, the healthcare professionals, the hospitals, and then you need to develop industrial policy focused on high technologies, such as intellectual property rights, access to financing. So it's a very, very complex framework that you need to put in place. And when you look at it from a historical standpoint, pharmaceutical innovation is really 80 years long. Of course, there's stuff before World War II, but really it kicked off after. And still today, it's very few countries that have the full package: U.S., Europe, Japan, South Korea, and then it starts to dribbles down, and countries have just one part of it, and then we see the emergence of China. So that's my interest. Regulation, and is our regulation fit to absorb all the data that we're producing, fit for purpose?
That's great. Well, thank you so much all for being here and looking forward to this. So I guess just sort of leading off that point of talking how much data is being generated around the world, I think we can all agree how important data is in all these different spheres. And particularly, say, in the technology field, we've definitely seen data become a commodity and something that's given companies huge commercial advantages and been able to kind of build these kind of monopolies, if you like. Within the pharmaceutical space and bioscience spaces more generally as well, it's a little bit more complicated. Data's a bit more sensitive, and particularly when we talk about patient data, Rebecca, as well. So I wanted to kick us off talking about data ownership and the balance between publicly accessible data that's important for advancing scientific research and basic research, and private data, which is important for commercializing different inventions or whatever it might be. And how we should think about treading that line between those two for societal good. So arbitrarily, let's kick it off somewhere in the middle. Whoever kind of wants to begin this. Easy topic.
If I may maybe respond, maybe less with an answer, but more sort of a challenge to your question, because what you've posed there is. Yes, it's a very valid question, but I think we need to sort of unpack it.
Sure.
One of the things I think we as society generally are getting slightly better at, but we need to be even better at, is not viewing data as sort of like a single monolithic thing, and it's all the same, and maybe it sits in silos, and there may be more than one silo, and that was sort of the model, the concept. But I think what we're starting to understand, it never was like that, and increasingly is changing, because there is different types of data for different purposes. Some of it's sensitive commercially, some of it's sensitive for personal use, and a large amount of it isn't at all. There's huge value to be had from it, but equally quality is still not great. The challenges around regulation are huge. So you start to see a way more sort of complex picture. And I think that we need to be better at understanding and describing and knowing what we're looking at. But in saying that, that's not a reason not to go do things and to start to explore. But I do think we need to educate all of ourselves just to understand the constructs of what we're looking at.
And certainly maybe to pick up from that in the pharmaceutical world, looking back, had we been having this conversation 10 years ago, I think it'd be very, very different. Since then, we've had the All Trials campaign. There was Ben Goldacre's Bad Pharma book, on which Roche featured for all the wrong reasons, let's say, along with many other pharmaceutical companies. But since then, I think there's been a real movement, and particularly also from the regulators. So you now see with Health Canada, there's an expectation that the documents that we provide as part of the dossier to demonstrate the safety and efficacy of our products are then made after the approval process, are then made available as open access in the public domain. Now, that's obviously created some issues from a privacy perspective. How do you make sure that those documents have clinical utility and understanding to a wider audience, but you don't accidentally give away or release some privacy information? So that's created a whole new kind of technology and pieces of work around how do you suitably anonymise documents. The EMEA also have a policy 70 whereby they also release some clinical trial documents. It went on a bit of a hiatus because of Brexit initially and the whole fact that EMEA had to move, and then since the COVID pandemic. But at some point that will come back online. And so from a public perspective, people can actually see the information that the regulators read and reviewed to make their decisions. And then on the data set side, which I think is a bit more niche, it requires, I guess, data scientists to actually understand that. That's now available for qualified researchers to access through not-for-profit groups like Vivli that many companies and other academic groups have kind of joined onto. And with all of those, the ethos it's not who's asking, it's the nature of the question you're asking. So again, there's a lot of privacy involved in that, thinking about that, but they tend to be what we call sort of closed systems. So you provide access to those data so people can go in and analyse the data, but they can't physically download the individual patient data. They can download the results. So I think there it's trying to do trade-offs, balancing, openness versus, what people actually want. And I think historically people are probably more interested in documents and data sets. To say 10 years ago it was all about reproducibility. We don't trust pharma, we don't trust the regulators. What are they looking at? But the reality has been actually access to data sets has been more about innovating, asking new questions, and actually we want to reproduce that analysis and say, is that p-value to 4 decimal places what we think it is? So that's the kind of pharma perspective.
Maybe just to add a compliment from the agriculture perspective, I too have seen over the 25 years I've been in the industry an evolution in this space, where confidentiality and data rights were really, really important, and they are important because it takes 300 million, I think, to develop on average a new crop protection product. It's maybe half that for a new GMO crop or something. These are inordinate amounts of investment, and so the IP element of data needs to be recognized. But I've seen an evolution too, and today a small minority of the actual data set being submitted for regulatory approval is in fact confidential and not available. And there is, especially maybe in the agriculture, others can comment on whether that's true in health as well, but an increasing innovation disconnect, right? So we need to make food production more sustainable, carbon, climate change and whatnot, and yet more and more the last decades, really the public has grown to understand less and less about agriculture and maybe understand where those innovations fit. So it is, I think, a balance the regulator probably has to walk as well, meeting the needs of society as well as innovation, but also on companies. And so Bayer has taken initiatives with the rest of industry as well, making data available to people, to the society, of course for non-commercial purposes. And so all of you see lots of bright minds, but also curious minds, I'm sure. Check out, for instance, the websites from any of these corporate players. You can go to Bayer website and look for the transparency link, and you can see an enormous amount of information there. And you can even request the study reports themselves that regulators review to make decisions. All you got to do is sign a little license or a waiver that you won't use it for, anti or competitive purposes. But there is an enormous amount of information available. And I think that's the responsibility also for the industry to help make data available and to help build the trust. I think you used the word trust. Trust and transparency go hand in hand. You can't have the one without the other.
So maybe just to turn the question around, there's the question about data, and especially in healthcare, is also about what is this, what are the data out there that we could use to improve healthcare? Okay, because right now we were just talking about the data that have been collected, and so maybe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we should clarify what we're talking about, because when we're talking about health data, it can take many forms. You have starting from, it's a jungle basically, starting from what is referred to as big data, or whatever is coming from sensors, digital sensors and so forth, the phone that we're carrying, all up to patient registries, electronic health records, highly curated data in the form of clinical trials, and so forth and so on. So it's we can't really talk about data in general. We have to be very specific, because you'll see that right now we're still at a stage where you have pockets of various data pools. And I think the big challenge is not so much, or another challenge is not so much transparency, but how can we curate, collect, and transform this data into evidence into knowledge into standard of care, and help people. And So the importance of health data has to be measured around a long trend of moving our health systems towards personalized medicine. And obviously, having all these available data supposedly should help us achieve that, to make sure that it's called P4 medicine. Basically, it's not just personalized, but it's also preventative, it's also predictive and participatory. And we'll come to that because we need to talk about the trust, the contract, the societal contract about how to use data. But what it means is that there is the hope or the promise of having at our hands something that can tell us pretty much what we should do, what we shouldn't do, what medicine we should take when, and so forth, and does it work. But to translate that promise, you need actually to do a lot of technical things and also create a legal framework. So we can come back to the technical aspects, but the legal framework is very important. And right now we can see that there's a big movement in Europe, but also globally. In Europe, they're setting up the European Health Data Space. So it's a major European initiative in order to harmonize the standards and enable all these various data pools to be networked, patient registries, for example, so that they can be tapped into and develop into evidence. But also in July or over the summer, you have the big regulatory authorities, the FDA, the European Medicines Agency, the Canadian agency. They've issued a joint statement on the use of real-world data and real-world evidence. So you can see there's a lot of interest in and work into harmonizing all these various data sets. Because, I mean, if you ask any regulatory person, data is meaningless or useless if it's not up to standard. And so far, if I hear from former commissioner of FDA, Robert Califf, it is not. Most of what's published is not fit for regulatory approval. You don't have randomization. There's a number of things that don't work. Maybe Becca can talk more about this than I do.
Yeah, I mean, I know there's how do you make that sort of data regulatory grade, I think has been a phrase. But I mean, hopefully one of the things maybe you'll get from this panel is if you're into data, now is a great time to be a data person because there's lots of potentials out there. Yeah. Absolutely.
So, Boris, yeah, I like to, you just used the phrase there, a societal contract on how we use data, and I think that's a great way of thinking about it. And I imagine that, we've, for the most part, tend to think of data in the context of Europe and America as places where, patient data, that we think about it from. But a lot of the people in this panel have worked globally and has been kind of interacting with lots of different global regulatory agencies and global companies and people generating data in many different forms. I wondered if we could share some perspectives on how data is treated from a societal perspective globally and what are some of the challenges that come with that.
You look at me.
I'm looking at you. Boris,
I think societal needs, people are people. I think they probably evolve in the same direction, maybe not all at the same speed everywhere. So I think Europe's certainly been the hotbed of the conversation about access to data, also privacy concerns, the privacy regulation. On the other hand, the right to keep personal data, the right to be forgotten, all of those kinds of things. I think Europe, it's a real active discussion. To my taste or experience, maybe more than it was in the US. But even when I worked in the US, we've had several Freedom of Information Act requests. These types of regulations exist in many countries around the world, where the interested society member, NGO, or whomever, litigant sometimes, can request the government to share critical information or key information as to how they reached the decision, to document the information. There is lots of litigation in that space as well that I've witnessed or seen. I'm not a lawyer, but in the US. So I think many people need the same, have the same desires, I think, for data access. In Asia as well, there too, in China, for instance, and other places, we've seen these requests. The regulations are a little bit different, but they try to strike always that balance between, the interest of the innovator and the intellectual property that's tied up in data as well. and this is in the regulatory approval context I'm speaking now, and the right for the public to know. Right? So I see generally parallels, but it's probably a hotter, more acute discussion here. In mainland Europe, the Commission, of course, has put new regulation in place as well to kind of force companies, if you want, but also recognizing many companies have already taken steps to share information, make things transparent. So that's all fine. I think that's for the good. We now have to navigate. There is associated the challenges with that. For instance, the data system in which in continental Europe we have to upload submissions is not yet where it needs to be, right? So we're bumping into real challenges with IUCLID, a system that's been used for many years in the REACH for basic chemicals. The data sets for a crop protection product are so much massively bigger, gigabytes and gigabytes, that we're bumping into technical challenges. It takes literally months and lots of consultation time to even upload the data to then meet those purposes. So I think there's still work to do, to work together with the regulators to make systems more performant, if you want, to meet those policy goals that there are. But we'll get there.
I think maybe in food, I might say experiences might be slightly different. And I'm just thinking as you're talking, is it different? How different? And maybe why? One of the things that characterises the food sector is, on one hand, you've got the huge global companies that you may see in something like pharmaceuticals, right the way down through to tiny micro businesses with one person working part-time. So you get the full range of that, and all of those are important players within that sector, and all behaving with different attitudes to the data that they generate, with sometimes not even realizing that they're generating data and the value of it. I think there are maybe sort of differences that are sort of deep-rooted from a cultural perspective as to people's attitudes to being open and transparent, and their societal views and how they might work together. So sometimes people see data as a societal good and will treat it as such. Maybe others might point maybe a little bit to the US, sometimes view data much more as its commercial value, and are quite protective and defensive about its commercial value. And so I'm sort of seeing slightly different views depending, I think, on sort of the underpinning sort of culture from different countries, as well as the different companies. And sometimes the companies have their own culture, and they carry often the resistance might be active resistance, and sometimes it's just legacy inertia. It takes a lot to move some of these big companies, and it's just easier not to. And we see that as a challenge, but at the same time see some of the new entrants coming in, unencumbered by all that baggage, digital data first, they go for it, they see the value, and stealing a march on the big companies. So I think there's quite a sort of big variety, certainly when I look at it from the point of view of food, consumers, retailers, and the processors, and I know I'm looking upstream to agriculture, and so got all of your people up there in agriculture as well. But again, it comes back to that sort of huge variety.
Rachel, do you want to defend the US?
No, I don't want to defend the US. We have a lot of faults. But I did want to talk a little bit about how intellectual property overlays in this, because I think data is often protected by trade secrets. So as you were pointing out, companies, this is their way to protect their intellectual property. Unlike patents, where the balance is struck, where by disclosing publicly to the public your invention, you get a limited monopoly, usually for 20 years. Trade secrets you can often hold in perpetuity as long as you keep them secret. So companies who have spent a lot of time and effort in gathering a lot of data want to see the return on that investment, and they want to keep their secrets secret. Where, as you were pointing out, the public also wants to see the data. So there's this tension, and I think people talk about trying to balance it, but I think you're never going to balance it. I think you just have to figure out where the tension is, and do the best that you can to appease all of the various stakeholders on any given data set. So any data set is, of course, going to have different stakeholders. But, yeah.
That's a really, really interesting point, actually, yeah, that patents rely on public disclosure to get your return on investment, and data's doing the opposite. I mean, with your time at Wilson Sonsini, looking at new startups coming out, were you seeing that big shift that companies that were data first, AI first, let's say, in many cases, were building a portfolio around trade secrets much more than they were around patents some time ago?
Yeah, you definitely see that from time to time. As a patent attorney, I mostly saw the patent side that companies wanted to protect, but even in the way that you collect data, sometimes in certain jurisdictions you can get patents on the way that you collect data, but I have definitely seen an increase where, companies' business model is around data more than, a compound, a molecule, a small molecule.
And certainly I'd say, thinking about, I suppose, intellectual property and commercially confidential information, when it comes to data set sharing and things like that, from a pharmaceutical perspective, and this was also led by the European Federation of the FPA, I can't remember what it all stands for, and Pharma, which is the US sort of trade body. They came up again, it was about 2012, 2013, some expectations of pharma. And sharing patient-level data sets is predicated on EU and US approval. So it's respecting the role of the regulators, making sure they've kind of made their reviews, and only then kind of making it accessible asset to qualified researchers. So I suppose they've kind of put that kind of check mark in there as well. So,
maybe one other addition, because I think both of you sparked thoughts in my. If I think of the US in the crop protection space, there is confidentiality as there is in other spaces too. I think of the biggest dossier I can think of, glyphosate. I think it's 180,000 pages now, the whole dossier together. There's a small section that probably still is confidential there, and it's essentially how the compound's made, because a chemist skilled in the art can tell from the impurity profile how it's made, and that's real competitive information. Now the safety data is still going to be available for the compound as made, so I think the relevant information is available. But yeah, there are examples of things that are truly, trade secret or specific to a company. There is not a lot left, and so for GMO crops, once upon a time, I think the sequence of the DNA insert or something like that was claimed confidential business information, but even that's now disclosed in patents, so there very often isn't much of anything other than maybe the name of our co-workers, because we also have to think of their personal safety, and there's all sorts of weird people out there in the world that would go after people because they disagree with what they do, for instance. So the names of people, that gets redacted or blacked out. So there are still, things in the regulatory dossier. And then the complement to that is data compensation. So if data is, not secret, there is another way to return back, to earn that return on investment is to be fairly compensated for the investment that an innovator has made in data. And so there is a lot of, I think, very enabling rules in the US in particular, also Canada, around data compensation that, for the duration of the exclusivity period is one thing, and then even after that for new data that are generated, that you get fairly compensated for then sharing, or for others to rely on that data that you've invested in. So I think there is a whole ecosystem, if you want, around data, protecting it, but also balancing it, or getting compensated then for, for an innovator.
I agree. I think we've been talking from individual companies' points of view, and we've been talking about the responses and the models and the different sort of structures that we use around data, whether we put them into a patent or whether we talk about raw data sets. One of the roles that we have in the Food Standards Agency, or our primary purpose, I should actually say, is we are here in the UK to serve the consumer. So that is every single person in the UK eating food, including visitors, yourselves, keeping you safe and ensuring that you know what it is that you are eating. And to do that, I look into the whole of the complex food supply chain, and so for me, it's not only understanding what each individual business might want to do, it's being able to ensure that very complex, long supply chain of food and data with the food is understood, and it's that is transparent, so we can see right where the food came from. It is what it says it is. It can prove itself to be safe. And increasingly, we are all concerned, businesses and consumers and government at large, about sustainability of that food. So again, we're challenging people to say, what you're producing, is it actually sustainable? And what about the waste in that supply chain? So I think that I think it's important to have those sorts of use cases and not just talk about the general principle and the rules around what we do with data. It's we do all of that for good reason, and it's either protection of maybe commercial positions, or it's for all of these other actors within the system. So I'm always very keen to be able to come up with those sorts of use cases, or look through and see back in time where people have actually exploited data, derived value from different types of data, linking different data sets together, seeing things they couldn't see before. So
that's great.
And maybe something of value for the audience, the particular audience we have here of researchers and biologists and so forth. Perhaps something you need to understand is when we're talking about data, and maybe that's what you have in mind, you're thinking about data sets like you mentioned, Glen, and gigabytes of stuff where you can, that there's something out there. And so the big thing is how to find some, how to design an algorithm to run through the data and maybe find some insights. And again, and so forth. And I would equate that to, from a pharma standpoint, to high throughput screening. So, okay, you go through something and there's going to be a lot of waste. But then when you're moving towards closer healthcare, then you have regulations and regulatory. And there, it's not so much to, it's not the insight, but is it fit for purpose? Is it robust enough to pass regulatory muster? Very, very different game. And then you're in humans. So humans, as soon as you touch humans, obviously, there's a lot of ethical considerations. Animals as well, of course, but humans in particular. And so completely different way to look at the data. It's not like just insights or something, a great idea. It's something that will go through regulatory approval, is ethical, and is concerned with privacy and patient rights and so forth. And there, I think the discussion that we all need to have and is currently taking place, as Erik mentioned about the ownership, how do you balance patient rights, citizen rights, and the need for innovation and research that is worthwhile for society. At the individual level, you have, a company will invest massive amount of money to generate data, high quality data. And then the question is it just for one particular purpose, or can it be reused? Because now that we have this data, and with digitalization and so forth, can we run through it, asking another question? But then what happens with the consent that the patient gave? Is the patient consent that was given for a particular trial, is it fit for the new research you want to do? So that's a very, so then you can see, can we reuse the data? Do we need to seek out a new consent? That's realistically impossible to find the people and so forth. But then it would be, if we can't, then it's a bit of a waste, because there are some answers built in this data and so forth. So you see what I mean by, you have the data on one hand, and then you have the legal framework that makes it, possible to turn that into a product that doctors can prescribe.
Absolutely. Well, that's great. So, I mean, with now sort of around 20 minutes to go, I'd like to open up to the floor, and if anyone's got any particular questions, feel free to direct it to a particular individual or ask it generally, and we can have a discussion. So, yeah, I think you shot your hand up really quickly.
Hi everyone, my name is Marco. I'm a PhD student in neuroscience in Cambridge. I have a question for Boris about public policy, and specifically a question looking at healthcare funding models, which is something that I'm quite interested in because I understand that we're living through different types of pandemic. One of them is the aging pandemic. And there's different sort of cost buckets within pharmaceuticals that are going up. One of them is the price of medicines, but you also have primary care, and you also have more hospitalizations because of increased number of comorbidities, particularly with the aging pandemic. So the question really is, how can we use data to increase effectiveness in sustainable models of innovation within healthcare and biotech, and why that hasn't happened yet?
All right. So that's a big question. Obviously, we all want, and every health authority want their health systems to perform better. But you have to understand, and you have to understand it's again it's a very recent thing. Modern healthcare systems is very modern, is very recent, and not that well distributed. So if you're talking about public health policy at the global level, the focus is still very much primary healthcare, just getting primary healthcare to work. And so when you're to your question, historically, before the 60s, basically before the thalidomide catastrophe, any product could be on the market with not much of a clinical trial evidence, meaning that the doctor was supposed to decide if it was good for the patient. So you understand, your question about data. So at that stage, the doctor would decide whether she felt that there was enough data to prescribe that product. So you can imagine that it wasn't really something we would accept today. So I would put that into this historical perspective. Health authorities understand that there's a lot of data, but at the same time, we see, especially when hospitals are trying to run deep learning algorithm and so forth, there's a lot of bizarre outcomes, and not everything has worked as promised. So I think it's still a journey, and first first we should start by working as we are doing on how to curate and collect quality data that we can then analyze. And in many cases, in healthcare systems, it's not the case. One thing you need to understand also, it's very, very hard to add when you're performing healthcare services. It's very difficult, although it sounds great, to ask clinicians to do something more, collect, record, and so forth. They're busy treating somebody, doing a health intervention. So the moment you're asking them for input at a quality level, then it delays or it puts more burden on them, whereas you need that resource for healthcare. So just keep that in mind.
Hi, my name is Reza. I'm a med student and a startup founder. So just to add to Marco's question, so I also work at a GP practice, and half my job is coding and results. And what I've noticed is most of the time I'm correcting results. I've seen MS be typed in as IBS, people going into colorectal clinics and reported as not attending. So how can you gather quality data when on the ground the collection is just so poor?
Yeah, well, that's my point. That's exactly right. There is some, sometimes bizarre results. I remember something where, if you run through hospital data, there's a particular product, and a number of men had received it, but it's for giving birth. So obviously there was a problem with the data gathering. I guess the digital health solution companies and smart people are thinking of solutions to make it seamless. I think that's the solution. But again, right now, if you don't put like a human brain, a trained person to look at the data, you will input a lot of waste or garbage. So garbage in, garbage out. I think we're still at this stage, but I would say there's different pools. So you have patient registries, for example, that are eminently better, and so there you can probably see how these could be networked. Right now, it's pretty much fragmented even within the same country.
And I guess you also need to think about in terms of the totality of data. So that real-world data will be huge in size. Maybe the quality isn't as good compared to a smaller, tightly controlled clinical trial. And I guess you'll be asking different questions of it and maybe looking for patterns and trends, you know, sort of signal versus noise, for, you know, which you'll have to kind of make those trade-offs. But I guess it's looking at the totality of information.
And maybe it's better for surveillance right now than for, you know, to develop research.
I was going to, if I may, just for 30 seconds, a sidebar back to agriculture, and it doesn't help the gentleman with his question, but more and more sensors in agriculture are being used. Mm-hmm. You know, think of machine-readable labels. You know, you scan the label of the thing that the input you need to apply, and, you know, smart application equipment just applies these things, creates logs, streams the data in real time, you know, spray drones applying pesticides rather than take the human element out. But I see the issue there where some doctor, some nurse needs to type in information. I think will always be fraud. So can you replace, you know, information streams with sensors? A bit like what we're doing, remote sensors, spray sensors, environmental sensors, you know, geospatial mapping. All of those things are really, really exciting areas of development in ag, and I think in other sectors as well. So sensors, don't know.
Yeah, it works with cows.
It works with cows. You know.
That's great. One over here.
Hi, Sasha from Cambridge as well as a PhD student. Thanks a lot for sharing your insights. So I guess to follow up with the idea of census to cater for heterogeneity of data, there's this big trend in small data AI currently, and the idea of using digital twins and kind of statistical models to compensate for missing data points. What is your what's your feel as to how much it's going to help us, and what do you think are the best applications of statistical tools to really work with heterogeneous data sets, which is what defines biology, in my opinion? Thanks.
So if I respond, and I'm not sure how relevant it's going to be to your particular experience, but from my point of view, I think there are opportunities, and we're using it to fix some of our data to get the most basic things right, which you think should be simple, like name and address of businesses. And you think, how hard can that be? And amazingly, the number of times people can spell the name of their own business differently. And similarly, the address of headquarters, they can get that wrong. So I think there are opportunities at the most basic level to fix some of that data, and we can correct that data because we can look at it and know that you actually meant this address, irrespective of how you spelt it. So I think we need to take the whole data quality seriously and apply all of these different tools and continue to do it. And it will just be a continuous thing all the time trying to fix it. Sometimes we'll have opportunities to jump over the problem like IoT. Sometimes we have to use these other tools. But the message is we cannot ignore it. And then on the more general AI point, we've been using AI to predict whether a business is going to ultimately end up by being a high-risk business in the way that it undertakes its activities in relation to production or selling food. And we've done that in different sort of sectors, but and it's been valuable, and we've had some good tools coming out of it. But some of the most interesting things for us hasn't just been the tools that we've produced, it's the insight that the AI techniques have given us on how the current physical, traditional regime works with all of those people. And being able to see the biases of all of the current regime, how the people work, how the inspectors work, whether there's men behave differently as inspectors than women. The most amazing things are coming out of some of this, which is just has been invisible to date, and everyone has assumed, don't go away thinking the whole of the food system is about to fall down around you. It certainly isn't, but at the same time there's a lot of insight to be derived. So it's not only the thing that you think you're developing, I'm going to develop this AI tool that's going to do that thing for me. It's all of the other insights it's given us around it.
And certainly, I mean, in terms of digital twins, I've not really been in that area, and I think the future is going to be more and more innovation, but I can see already there's a lot of what they call historical trial data usage. So if you've run trials in a particular disease area many times, can you use the control arm data from that study to actually have a smaller control arm on a study you're running today, so you're potentially exposing less patients to the thing you might not think is going to work. So I think, and there's a whole load of sort of statistical, you know, Bayesian borrowing, all sorts of methodologies about how you can use control arm from another study and supplement information to trial you're running today, and that's also in conversations with the regulators in terms of how they approve those analyses. So I think it's a whole burgeoning area that we'll just continue to see more and more as we're able to reuse data and use it in other ways.
Who's got the mic? Oh, up top corner.
Hi, I'm Milena. I also work at the Food Standards Agency. I have a slightly different question from a regulation perspective, I guess. So all of this kind of data, for most of the population, it's like a black box. They have no idea what it is. They can't understand it. You know, when you release 180,000 pages of documents, most of the population can't start anything with that. So how do we create trust, and how do we bridge that gap between, you know, people are being told something, but they can't actually understand all this data they're being shown to back that up? So how do we kind of bridge that gap, and how do we ensure that there's a maintenance of trust in what we're saying about all this data that we have nowadays?
Since you mentioned 180,000, maybe I can start. I think
Wasn't targeted.
it's not always that big, but that's the biggest I know. It's a rhetorical question, I think, a little bit. I think we need to recognize it's really, really hard, and it needs to be a shared responsibility. So when you go to that Bayer.com website or glyphosate.eu, for glyphosate specifically, it's a beautiful website there, you can access the summary information. That's still very technical for a layman person. That's probably still too complicated. You can, if you're skilled in the art, you can even request those study reports and get them and go even deeper into the data, of all the safety data. But that's not going to address the layman's person's need either. So in addition, you've got videos, you've got explanatory text, you've got infographics, etc. The company, whatever, or the industry association in this case, have developed to try to make sense of this, maybe for a more layman person. And I think that's going to be a long slog. And trust needs to be built with transparency, not only transparency. I think, and I think regulators have a role to play, academics have a role to play, schools have a role to play, industry has a role to play, to help people understand just the magnitude of the challenge in this case that the planet is facing. Sustainability has to happen, right? More sustainable and productive, more productive food systems too. And we, I think, have to explain the public about that, and then show how these innovations come together to help towards that outcome. It's a shared responsibility. I think you wanted to maybe chime in.
Well, I was going to say, just within the sort of the drug development space, there is an expectation these days that clinical trial participants receive a plain language summary of the trial they've participated in, and they generally get written by expert groups, because we in drug development are the worst people to write plain language summaries because we've been immersed in all this, acronyms and things. So really that is the expectation going forward, and even making those available publicly. But then we've also had on the opposite side the tension that if you share that plain language summary with a participant too early, particularly from an FDA perspective, they might see it as unintended advertising of your product. So you've got to kind of make these trade-offs about how much can you share in a meaningful way, in a timely manner with someone who's participating in a trial versus being seen to kind of be challenging the regulatory process. So I think we definitely need to be doing more in this space, but it's not an easy answer.
Yeah, and this is a very important question. It's broader than just pharmaceutical research or healthcare, because it goes to the core of the democratic debate. And shortly put, even fake news can be fact-based. And so you can put out, I can assure you that if, I can look at the 180,000 pages, I will find things just, that fit my position, whatever it is. I will find it, no worries. And I will extract it and exploit it. So access, transparency is not enough. And what we've seen with the COVID-19 vaccines is that obviously there is vaccine hesitancy, and facts don't work. Research shows that showing people research doesn't work. Okay, so that's a famous quote, not from me, but it tells everything. And but what has transpired, and I don't think it's well known or well embraced, is the trust aspect. And how do you make that happen? And actually going, meeting people, talking to people on a regular basis, not just to tell them you should do this, you should do that, is very important. And what we can see across all our democracies is that if there is anger and reaction towards government, elite, and so forth, the media, mainstream media, it's also built in the fact that you don't really care about me. I don't hear you so much, and so forth. So I know that in the UK there is an initiative to create a sort of advisory board or council, or you need an intermediary. You need to create a trustworthy body in order to achieve that connection. Yes, we care about what you think and who you are, and little by little, maybe that body can serve as an intermediary in order to make facts or evidence palatable to society. But you have to account for the fact that there's a whole business model now with social media, where the click rate and so forth built in fighting that. Okay, it's you make right now, if you're a scientist or an economist or whatnot, and for some reason you became famous for having said something really stupid, well, you can compare how your income looks like staying stupid versus going back to the facts, and that's a problem.
I think that's probably a good place to leave this. I also liked research shows that showing people research doesn't work. That's good notes to leave it on. So yeah, I want to thank our panelists a lot for being here and sharing their insights. I think it was, I found it fascinating, particularly how many different industries that are being touched here, and different types of data, and how diverse all of that is. So yeah, enjoyed the discussions around data ownership, the global perspectives of it. Trust and transparency came up a few times, and data quality. So lots and lots for us to really think about. So yeah, can I give us all a round of applause for panelists?